Good evening, my friend. Settle in with something warm. Tell me, what's the weather like where you're listening tonight? A cold breeze, a cup of tea, or maybe a quiet room all to yourself? Share it below so our cozy circle keeps growing, and if you're new here, don't forget to join us. The candle's lit, the kettle's soft. Now, breathe gently, lean closer. Tonight's mystery is about to begin. Snow drifted across Street Mary Mead in a quiet, unhurried way, settling lightly on garden walls and chimney tops as the village slipped into its winter hush. The hour was early evening, that soft time when lamps glowed behind curtains and the world outside turned pale and still. Inside her small sitting room, Miss Marple sat comfortably near the hearth, her knitting resting in her lap. Simple wool, warm colors, a gentle domestic rhythm she had always cherished. The fire was steady, the tea was warm, and the room felt safe in the way only long winters could make it feel. She worked, each stitch with calm patience. Knit, pause, knit again. A small smile touched her lips at the thought of the muffler slowly taking shape. She enjoyed these little comforts: needlework, warm tea, quiet evenings, and the steady crackle of a fire that had seen many seasons come and go. The room smelled faintly of lavender polish and old books. The calm had weight, the kind that settled around a person gently. No hurry, no noise, only peace. Outside, the snow thickened. Soft flakes brushed the window pane like quiet fingerprints. A lamplight across the lane flickered once, then steadied. Miss Marple noticed it in that unobtrusive way she noticed everything. Her eyes rarely missed a detail, no matter how small. But tonight she allowed herself to rest. Even she deserved a quiet hour. Even the busiest of minds needed warmth. She lifted her cup. The tea was still steaming, a comfort in her hands, a small companion. She set the cup down, picked up the needles again, worked 2 careful rows. Simple, calm, predictable. A long day behind her, and nothing in the evening to trouble her thoughts. At least, that was what she believed. The fire shifted. A log settled more deeply. Sparks whispered upward. Miss Marple glanced at it fondly. A dependable friend, she murmured softly, amused by her own habit of giving personality to household things. But it was that kind of evening quiet enough that even objects seemed to breathe with her. Then, without warning, the stillness broke. A sharp sound cut across the snow-laden lane. Sudden, crisp, not loud but out of place. A window, slamming, hard. Miss Marple's hands stopped mid-stitch. Just like that. Still, perfectly still. Her blue eyes lifted from her wool as naturally as breath rising from a cup. She looked toward her own window, listening. The air outside was too cold for carelessness. People rarely left windows open in such weather, and no wind strong enough had passed through the village in the last hour. She waited a moment, listening, counting the silence that followed. Nothing. Only the soft fall of snow, only the gentle crackle of the fire, only the small, familiar hum of her cottage resting for the night. But she knew the sound had not been imagination, nor accident, nor some harmless shift in the weather. Her needles did not move. Miss Marple felt something was wrong. The knock came quickly, too quickly. Not a gentle tap, but an urgent rhythm that did not belong to quiet winter evenings. Miss Marple set her knitting aside with careful hands, listening for one small moment before rising. The fire glowed behind her, steady and warm, a comforting reminder that some things remained constant, even when the night did not. She reached the door quietly. A second knock came, sharp, breathless, almost trembling. When she opened it, Mrs. Clement stood there in the snow, cheeks flushed, breath escaping in short white bursts. Snowflakes clung to her hat. Her gloves were damp from haste, and her expression carried that familiar mixture of fear and duty that often brought concerned villagers to Miss Marple's doorstep. Kindness first, that was always the rule, so Miss Marple stepped aside at once. "Do come in, my dear. You look chilled through." Mrs. Clement entered with a small nod, wiping her gloves carefully on the mat. The fire met her with gentle warmth, a soft comfort. Miss Marple poured tea without a word, letting the steam rise between them like a small promise of calm. Only when Mrs. Clement's hands wrapped around the cup did Miss Marple speak. "Now then, tell me what troubles you." The vicar's wife swallowed, gathering herself. "It's Mrs. Ivy Harrow," she said finally. The name alone changed the room's air. Ivy Harrow, quiet, punctual, gentle with her greetings, was not a woman people worried about. "She never arrived home tonight," Mrs. Clement continued. "She was expected by dusk. Her neighbor saw her lamp unlit, and when they checked her cottage—" She paused, drew a deeper breath, shook her head softly. Her window was open, in this cold, wide open, and her scarf was left on the sill. "You know the one, the blue and white one she always wore." Miss Marple lowered herself back into her chair, the fire casting a warm circle around them. She took in every detail with quiet, thoughtful eyes. "Her scarf on the sill," she repeated gently. "Not dropped, but placed." Mrs. Clement nodded. "It looked that way." Miss Marple folded her hands lightly. Kind eyes, soft voice. But her mind had already begun its careful path. Was there any sign she returned at all? Any footprints? Any lamp turned over? Any cup left warm? "No," Mrs. Clement whispered. "Nothing. Only the open window. And the scarf." Miss Marple let the fire crackle between them. A slow, thoughtful silence. She had watched many winters pass through Street Mary Mead, and she knew the quiet patterns of village life. People returned home on time. People latched windows in the cold. People did not leave scarves behind unless something interrupted their hands. She asked one more gentle question. "Did anyone hear anything before the window was found open?" Mrs. Clement hesitated. Her neighbor mentioned a sound, but she wasn't sure. The wool in Miss Marple's knitting basket shifted slightly as if settling into its own worry. Snow pressed softly against the glass. The fire warmed the room but not the air between the two women. Something had broken the evening's peace. Something subtle, but something real. Miss Marple touched the rim of her teacup. A small, quiet gesture. This wasn't ordinary. The room held its quiet warmth for a moment longer, the fire offering its soft glow, as if trying to shield them from the cold truth waiting outside. Miss Marple watched Mrs. Clement lift her teacup again. The poor woman's hands trembled, not from fear alone, but from the cold she had pushed herself through to reach this cottage. Miss Marple's gaze lowered. The gloves lying across Mrs. Clement's lap were damp, properly damp, not from melted snow gathered casually on a walk, but from someone who had moved quickly, perhaps even hurried through the lane. She noticed details the way some noticed scents or songs, small threads, quiet truths. And these gloves were a thread, a fresh one. Mrs. Clement had come directly from Ivy Harrow's lane, too quickly, too breathlessly. Something she had seen there must have unsettled her far more than she allowed herself to speak aloud. Miss Marple said nothing about it, not yet. Kindness first. Always kindness first. Still, she tucked the observation gently into her thoughts, the way she slipped loose bits of yarn into her knitting basket for later. The fire shifted. Snow tapped lightly on the window. Miss Marple let the sounds guide her memory back to a small conversation from early autumn. Ivy Harrow, standing in the churchyard, after morning service, fussing with her gloves and avoiding direct replies. A sweet woman, soft-spoken, but troubled that day. She had leaned in a little closer, as if confiding a secret she barely trusted herself to believe. "Sometimes," Ivy had said, "I hear footsteps outside my cottage at night. Very light, very slow. Just there." Miss Marple had reassured her kindly, telling her that village paths always carried wandering sounds, cats, hedgehogs, late-walking neighbors, but Ivy's eyes had stayed clouded. Afraid of something unseen, something unspoken. Miss Marple recalled that look now. The candlelight, the trembling hands, the worry Ivy had tried to fold neatly into silence. Perhaps it had not been imagination after all. Mrs. Clement set her cup down at last. The cup clinked lightly against the saucer. Miss Marple caught that sound too. Did you see the window yourself? She asked gently. Before anyone else reached it? Mrs. Clement nodded. Yes, I was the one who noticed it. Miss Marple leaned back, the fire warming the hem of her skirt. Her eyes softened. And you're sure it opened inward? Oh, yes, Mrs. Clement whispered. It was pulled open, not pushed. Miss Marple folded her hands. A quiet gesture, thoughtful. Then something troubles me, she said softly. If the window opens inward, why was the snow outside so disturbed? Mrs. Clement blinked. You saw that? I noticed enough, Miss Marple answered gently. Snow does not lie. It does not pretend. It only tells its story to those who listen. The fire crackled. A soft spark leapt. The air grew still, and Miss Marple felt the weight of a truth forming slowly, steadily, unmistakably. One contradiction. One simple contradiction. And that changed everything. The cold met Miss Marple the moment she stepped outside. A crisp, steady cold that wrapped itself around the village like a woolen shawl pulled tight. Snow lay in soft folds. Across the lane, pale and untouched in some places, pressed and disturbed in others. She wrapped her own scarf, light blue, lovingly knitted years ago more snugly around her neck. A comforting little thing. Familiar, warm. And it was always in winter that small comforts mattered most. The village was unusually quiet. Houses drowsed under layers of frost. Chimneys exhaled faint wisps of smoke into the evening air. The lamplight glowed softly along the lane, blurring a little in the drifting snowflakes. Miss Marple walked slowly, her steps light, careful not to crush any patterns before studying them. She had always been gentle with clues. Gentle with people, too. Both required patience. Both required respect. Christmas was not far off, and the milk boy, young Henry Parsons, was finishing his stray deliveries with his cap pulled low against the wind. He paused when he saw her approaching. "Evening, Miss Marple," he called, his breath forming quick white puffs. "Good evening." "Henry," she replied warmly. "You're out late in this weather." He shrugged shyly. "Mrs. Baxter forgot her jar again. Thought I'd better bring it before it froze." Miss Marple nodded. A kind boy, always helpful. She lowered her voice just a little. "Tell me, Henry, did you happen to be near Ivy Harrow's lane tonight?" He blinked. "I passed it, only for a moment." "And did you notice anything unusual?" Henry hesitated, looked down, kicked lightly at the snow with his boot. "I thought I heard something," he admitted softly. Like someone talking. But when I looked, no one was there." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his arm. "You've been very helpful, dear." He nodded once, then hurried on, his figure disappearing slowly into the pale drift. Miss Marple continued forward, following the narrow bend toward Ivy Harrow's cottage. Snow thickened around the small garden gate, gathering in peaceful silence. But peace rarely told the whole truth. Not tonight. Not after the open window. She bent down carefully near the sill. The snow here told its own quiet story. A broken button lay half buried in the powder, small, dark, oval-shaped. Not a woman's button. No, this belonged to a man's coat. Miss Marple picked it up gently, the cold pressing lightly against her fingertips. She slipped it into her pocket with care, as if handling a fragile memory. Then she looked up, slowly, calmly, studying the faint print patterns around the cottage. Footsteps, several, but one set caught her attention more than the others. Larger, deeper, leading away. No, leading toward Willowbridge Path, toward the darker stretch of lane, toward the trees, toward something unknown. Miss Marple stood very still, listening, watching the shapes pressed into snow. Each print held a small truth, each mark a whisper, each path a direction taken with purpose. Most footprints belonged to neighbors who had hurried over after seeing the open window. But one path, one single track, did not match any of the others. Not in shape, not in weight, not in direction. But one footprint didn't match the others. Constable Pork arrived sooner than Miss Marple expected, his boots crunching loudly across the frozen lane as he approached Ivy Harrow's cottage. A lantern swung in his hand, its soft circle of light wavering over the snow. He always carried it, even when he claimed he didn't believe in fuss. Miss Marple watched him with a gentle patience as he examined the window, his breath puffing steadily into the cold air. The lamp inside Ivy's cottage still glowed faintly, its warmth spilling just enough light to remind them that the room had not been empty for long. Pork shook his head slowly. "It's the wind, Miss Marple," he said at last, wiping frost from his moustache. "Widow Harrow must have wandered off. Happens more often than you think. These winter nights unsettle the elderly." Miss Marple folded her gloved hands neatly in front of her. Her scarf fluttered slightly with the breeze. "The wind, Constable?" she repeated softly. "Strong enough to open only one window and leave all the others perfectly shut." Pork cleared his throat. "Well, yes. Might have caught the latch." She nodded thoughtfully, not arguing, not pressing, simply guiding. "And the lamp inside," she said gently. "Still warm, still bright. If she wandered off, she would not have left it burning at dusk." Ivy was careful with such things. She believed lamps wasted oil if unattended. Surely you remember her saying so. Pork shifted uncomfortably. He did remember. Ivy Harrow was thrifty and particular, a woman who counted every matchstick and folded every cloth twice. The lamp's warmth contradicted her habits. But he did not say it aloud. Miss Marple stepped closer to the sill. Snow clung to the edge, undisturbed except for the faint imprint of the scarf that had been left there. "And the tea inside," she added softly. 2 cups poured, 2 places set, 1 cup still steaming when Mrs. Clement arrived. Ivy was not expecting the wind, Constable. She was expecting a person. The lantern shook slightly in Pork's hand, though he tried to hide it with a stern breath. "Even so," he muttered, "villagers panic too quickly. She probably stepped out and lost her footing. The snow hides tracks fast." Miss Marple looked at him with that gentle, knowing kindness she had always possessed. "The snow hides many things," she agreed softly, "but not so fast that it erases footprints leading toward Willowbridge Path." Pork's eyes darted up. "Footprints?" "1 set," she replied. "Distinct. Deep. Not made by Ivy." The constable glanced toward the path, his lantern beam trembling slightly as it passed over the uneven prints. He swallowed, trying to find his confidence again. "It still doesn't mean anything," he insisted weakly. "Could have been a passerby. Could have been anyone." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Of course. It could have been." The firelight from Ivy's cottage flickered gently across the snow, casting soft golden shapes that wavered like unspoken truths. The cold pressed in, the wind whispered along the hedges, and Constable Pork's certainty thinned with each breath he took. Miss Marple watched the footprints one last time, thoughtful, calm, certain. Then her voice lowered, warm but unmistakably firm. "Accidents don't behave like this." Miss Marple made her way toward the neighboring cottage with steady, unhurried steps, her boots pressing softly into the snow. The evening had deepened into a deeper shade of blue, the kind that made lamplight glow warmer and footsteps echo more clearly across the lane. Gideon Rowe's cottage stood just beyond Ivy Harrow's, its small windows lit brightly, as if someone inside wanted the world to know he was very much awake. A curious detail. A man living alone rarely kept every room burning past dusk, not unless something unsettled him, not unless he needed the comfort of a fire too much. She approached the door and tapped gently. A moment of stillness followed. Then quick footsteps. A pause. Then the door opened. Gideon Rowe appeared, shoulders stiff, eyes slightly too wide, face flushed more from worry than warmth. The smell of pipe tobacco drifted outward with him, strong, lingering, unmistakable. Ivy Harrow disliked pipe smoke. She had said so many times. Claimed it stuck to curtains like stubborn memories. The scent here clung heavily, as if someone had smoked in a hurry, or smoked while thinking too hard. "Miss Marple," Gideon said, attempting a polite smile. "Out in this cold. Surely you should be resting by your fire." She returned the smile with gentle warmth. "A short walk does one good, Mr. Rowe. May I step in for a moment? There's something I wish to ask you." His hesitation lasted only a breath, but Miss Marple noticed it. She noticed how his hand tightened on the edge of the door, how he glanced behind him toward the sitting room, how the fire inside crackled too loudly, burning too fiercely for such a late hour. Still, he stepped aside. "Yes, yes, of course. Do come in." The cottage was warm, very warm, far warmer than a person sitting alone usually needed. The fire snapped brightly in the grate, flames too high, too eager. A woolen pair of gloves lay drying on a small stool beside the hearth, glistening slightly from melted snow. Miss Marple's eyes rested on them only briefly, observing, filing away. Then she looked around the room. Everything was tidy, almost overly tidy, as if someone had cleaned too quickly, too recently, too nervously. "You heard about Ivy?" Miss Marple asked softly. Gideon swallowed, hard. "Yes, terrible thing. She must have wandered off. The cold confuses people." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "You noticed her window open?" Another pause. Longer this time. His gaze shifted toward the fire. "Yes, I think so. Hard to recall." Her voice softened further. "Mr. Rowe, did you see anyone near her cottage tonight?" He turned away, cleared his throat, adjusted the stool by the fire, though it needed no adjusting. "People come and go. Hard to say. The snow confuses tracks." Miss Marple stepped closer to the fire, letting its warmth touch her hands. "You're right. Snow can confuse many things." She allowed a small silence to settle. "But it doesn't confuse direction." He stiffened, just slightly, but enough. Miss Marple saw it. Kind eyes, soft tone, quiet certainty. But inside her mind, the pattern sharpened. He was hiding something. The cottage felt colder now that Ivy Harrow was absent from it. A lived-in warmth had slipped away, leaving the air strangely still, as if the rooms themselves were waiting for her return. Miss Marple stepped inside with quiet care, carrying a small lantern, to soften the corners where shadows gathered too heavily. She set it upon the table, and its golden glow spread gently across the wooden surfaces, warming them by mere inches. The fire in the grate had long gone out. Only a thin curl of ash remained, resting like a tired whisper at the hearthstone. She moved slowly, touching nothing but observing everything. Ivy kept a tidy home. Neat, thoughtful. Many things in this cottage had a place, and each place seemed to reflect her gentle nature. A folded shawl on the chair back, a teacup rinsed and set aside, a pair of spectacles resting near a stack of old magazines, familiar comforts, faint traces of a quiet life. Miss Marple felt a pang of tenderness at the sight. A woman who lived alone often surrounded herself with small companions, books, cups, soft fabrics, things that asked for very little yet offered company of their own. The snow outside pressed lightly against the windows, blurring the view and silencing the lane. Miss Marple bent down near the table, studying the floor for any sign of a hurried step or misplaced object. Something glimmered faintly beneath the table leg, half hidden by a patched rug. She lowered herself carefully, her knees protesting only a little. Her fingertips brushed metal. Cold, smooth, unexpected. A locket. Miss Marple drew it out slowly, letting the lantern light catch its surface. It was a small silver oval, simple, worn, lovingly handled many times. The clasp was delicate, almost fragile. She opened it with care. Inside, a photograph. Ivy Harrow, younger, softer. With her stood a young girl, no more than 6 or 7, bright eyes, curly hair. A child who resembled no one Miss Marple had ever seen in the village. Miss Marple studied the photograph gently. Ivy had always insisted she had no family left, no children, no siblings. She had said it with that steady certainty people use when they wish the subject closed, and yet here was a child, held close, smiling, belonging, to Ivy in a way that felt unmistakably real. A small folded paper was tucked behind the photo. Miss Marple lifted it with tender fingers. The edges were softened by time, A crease ran through its center. She unfolded it slowly, letting her breath steady. Only one word was written inside. One word in Ivy's handwriting. Return. Miss Marple closed the locket gently, holding it in both hands as if holding a fragile truth. The lantern flickered. The silence deepened. The room grew heavier with meaning that had not yet taken shape. A daughter? A plea? A warning? A secret waiting far too long? Whatever it was, Ivy had hidden it, and hidden it well. Miss Marple's eyes softened with sadness and certainty. That object shouldn't exist. Morning brought no comfort to Street Mary Mead, though the snow had softened into a thin, pale mist that drifted lazily over the hedges. Miss Marple wrapped her warm shawl a little tighter around her shoulders as she stepped outside. The village stirred. With that slow, familiar rhythm, kettles whistling, boots scraping against steps, doors opening to let in cold air and let out warm breath. Yet beneath that normality pulsed a quiet worry. Ivy Harrow's absence had spread across the village like the chill seeping under doorframes. People felt it. People whispered. And Street Mary Mead was never shy about whispers. Miss Marple made her way toward the High Street, where she found Mrs. Bantry briskly sweeping a thin patch of snow from her garden path. The woman looked up at once. Her eyes held more curiosity than fear, but both were present. "Miss Marple," she said quickly, lowering her voice as if the snow might carry her words. "I didn't want to trouble the constable, but Ivy had a visitor last week, late in the evening. A stranger. No one knows who he was, and Ivy didn't want to talk about it afterward." Miss Marple listened with gentle patience. "A visitor?" she repeated softly. "At her age, and at that hour? Unusual indeed." Mrs. Bantry nodded firmly. "Tall man. Dark coat. Didn't stay long." She hesitated. Ivy looked unsettled for days after. Miss Marple offered a kind smile, placed a warm hand on Mrs. Bantry's arm, and continued onward. At the vicarage, the vicar's wife greeted her with a steaming pot of tea already waiting on the small table. Miss Marple accepted the cup with a grateful nod. The warmth spread through her hands a steady comfort against the winter air. "Ivy bought special envelopes last week," the vicar's wife said quietly, leaning closer. "Good quality ones. Blue-edged. Expensive. She told the shopkeeper they were for something important." Miss Marple set her cup down. The detail caught gently in her mind, like a loose thread that needed tugging. "Ivy never spent money lightly," she murmured. "That's exactly why it struck me," the vicar's wife replied. "She acted secretive, not in a guilty way, in a frightened way." "Miss," Marple thanked her kindly and stepped back into the lane, letting the cool air settle her thoughts. Her final stop was the grocery shop, where Mr. Welburn was arranging tins on a shelf. When he saw her, he sighed softly. "Sad business, Miss Marple," he said. "Ivy came by 2 days ago, bought stamps, and I found her crying near the postbox outside. Quiet little tears. She tried to hide them." Miss Marple felt the ache of that image. Ivy alone. Ivy frightened. Ivy holding a letter she couldn't bring herself to send or couldn't bring herself to destroy. The pieces fit too neatly to ignore. A secret visitor. Expensive envelopes. Quiet tears. Hidden fear. And yet Ivy had always insisted she had no family. Miss Marple paused in the snow, her breath soft and steady. Somebody was lying. Night returned with a quiet heaviness, the kind that softened the village and deepened every shadow. Miss Marple stepped onto Willow Bridge Path with her small lantern held close to her chest. Its warm glow made a fragile circle of light around her boots, lifting gently with every step. Snow clung to the branches overhead, bending them slightly toward the earth, like old friends leaning in to share secrets they had overheard. The air tasted sharp, clean, still, the kind of stillness that made even brief sounds linger longer than they should. She tightened her woolen scarf against the cold, a comfort, a shield, and she followed the narrow, winding path that stretched toward the old willow tree, a tree that had witnessed more villagers' stories than perhaps any living soul in Street Mary Mead. The branches drooped low, their shadows spreading over the snow like long, dark fingers. Miss Marple approached with quiet care, the lantern swinging gently, gently, gently. Then she saw it. A scatter of torn paper near the base of the tree, small pieces caught in the snow, some crisp, some damp, edges uneven, as if ripped in haste. She knelt slowly, the cold pressing through the fabric of her skirt, but she barely noticed it. Her fingers moved delicately, lifting each fragment with the same tenderness she used when handling old letters from her own youth. The snow around the scraps held faint indentations, suggesting someone had knelt here too recently. Too recently. The lantern's light revealed a faint blue tint on one scrap. A blue edge, the expensive envelopes Ivy had purchased. Miss Marple breathed out softly, her breath a pale cloud dissolving into the winter air. She gathered the pieces carefully, forming a small stack in her gloved hand as if piecing together an unfinished confession. She stood and lifted the lantern higher. The snow around the willow tree held patterns that were harder to read than most, but Miss Marple had spent a lifetime learning how to listen to the language of disturbed earth, bent grass, shifted snow. Footprints circled the trunk, not one set. Two, one lighter, one heavier, one belonging to someone moving slowly, the other belonging to someone moving with intent, quickly, purposefully. The snow recorded hesitation, movement, conflict. Miss Marple moved closer, letting the lantern sweep the ground in a gentle arc. The prints were uneven in places, as if someone had stumbled or been pulled. The shapes overlapped, then separated, then overlapped again. A quiet struggle written in the snow's soft script. A faint dark mark near the roots caught her eye. She huddled down, brushing delicately at the patch with her gloved fingertips. A scorch mark, small but undeniable. Something had been burned here, recently. A letter? A message Ivy had tried to destroy, or someone else had destroyed for her. Miss Marple's lantern flickered. The willow branches shivered. The cold deepened with each discovery. The pieces spoke, though not yet in full sentences, but she understood enough. A meeting had happened here. A message had been torn. Words had been burned. Steps had circled with fear. Miss Marple gathered every fragment with tender, deliberate hands. This was not an accident. Morning light crept slowly into Miss Marple's cottage, settling across the small sitting room in a gentle golden hush. The fire had been revived with fresh kindling, crackling softly as if offering comfort for the work ahead. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair, a woolen shawl tucked around her shoulders, a simple cup of tea warming her hands. Steam rose in quiet curls. The scent of lavender polish drifted faintly from the nearby bookshelf. It was a peaceful scene, yet peace rarely stayed long when truth asked to be examined. She placed the cup aside and folded her hands neatly in her lap. Her mind, calm but sharp, began gathering the pieces scattered across the past 24 hours. She had learned that puzzles seldom revealed themselves all at once. They preferred to whisper, to hint, to wait for someone patient enough to listen without fear or hurry. And Miss Marple always listened. She started with the locket. A young girl, Ivy's arm around her, a warm smile frozen in time, but Ivy had always insisted she had no family. No child, no relatives, no one left in the world to cause her worry, and yet her trembling hands had kept that photograph hidden behind silver edges, hidden where no one would think to look, hidden perhaps because she feared someone might return unexpectedly, or because she feared someone already had. Miss Marple breathed softly and lifted the next thread. The burned letter beneath the willow tree, torn pieces, a scorch mark, a midnight struggle hidden in snow. The blue-edged paper matched the expensive envelopes Ivy had purchased. A private message, a desperate call, a plea for return or refusal. Someone had tried to erase it. Someone had felt its words were dangerous. She turned her attention to the button she had found in the snow. Dark, oval, heavy. Not Ivy's, not Mrs. Clement's, not belonging to any woman in Street Mary Mead. A man's coat, most likely, torn away in haste, lost in fear, a silent witness left behind on a cold patch of earth. Then the 2 cups of tea waiting on Ivy's table. 2, not 1. Ivy had expected someone, welcomed someone, trusted someone enough to pour a cup and warm the room for them. But the tea had gone cold on only one side. The other cup still held warmth when Mrs. Clement arrived. Miss Marple saw the scene clearly. Ivy had not left her cottage willingly. She had been interrupted, startled, or frightened, and finally, the window, forced open, from inside. Snow disturbed on the outer ledge. Tracks leading toward Willowbridge Path, not away. Ivy had been taken toward danger, not slipping into it by chance. With all the pieces before her, Miss Marple let her breath settle. Her kindness remained, but her focus sharpened. She defined the pattern forming quietly at the edges. Motive fear means midnight meeting opportunity. The visitor Ivy expected. She rested her hands on her shawl, eyes soft, but certain. Only one person could have done it. The snow had thickened by late afternoon, falling in soft, deliberate flakes that muted every sound in Street Mary Mead. Miss Marple walked the short distance to Gideon Rowe's cottage with quiet purpose, her shawl pulled snugly around her shoulders. The air carried a faint scent of wood smoke, drifting from chimneys in gentle curls. It was the kind of cold that made a person's breath feel heavier, slower, as though the world wanted time to pause. Miss Marple welcomed that slowness. Conversations of importance often required it. Gideon's cottage glowed warmly behind frosted windows. Too warmly. The fire inside burned with the same insistence it had the night before. She knocked gently, letting her hand rest against the wooden door for a moment. The sound was soft, almost polite, the kind of knock that gave a person room to breathe before answering. Gideon opened the door after a delay that stretched just a bit too long. His expression was strained, though he tried to mask it with a thin smile. "Miss Marple," he said, voice slightly unsteady. "Back again? The snow hasn't scared you indoors, I see." She smiled kindly. "A little snow never does. But I was hoping to speak with you for just a moment, only if you have the time." His shoulders tightened, but he stepped aside. "Of course. Come in." The cottage was warm, almost uncomfortably so. The fire crackled loudly, throwing light across drying mittens and scattered coals. The room felt restless, as though it had been paced through more than once. Miss Marple took a seat near the hearth, folding her gloves neatly on her lap. She let the silence settle. Gentle, calm, deliberate. Then she began. "Mr. Rowe," she said softly, "were you expecting a letter these past few days?" Gideon blinked. "A letter? No. Why would I be?" Miss Marple did not challenge him. Her voice remained warm, patient. "Because Ivy purchased expensive envelopes earlier this week, far nicer than she usually bought, and because someone burned a letter last night near the willow tree." His breath caught, only slightly, but she saw it. The fire reflected in his eyes, bright and unsteady. She continued gently. "Did Ivy speak of returning something? Perhaps to someone she once knew?" Gideon looked away. His hands tightened around the chair back. The firelight flickered across the tension in his features. "She didn't say much," he muttered. She kept her worries to herself. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Ivy often did. But someone was troubling her, someone she expected last night. His jaw clenched, a small involuntary movement. "Maybe," he whispered. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her tone soft, full of kindness. "Mr. Rowe, did you try to stop her from leaving the cottage?" The question cracked the thin layer of composure he had worn since opening the door. He exhaled shakily, looked toward the window, avoided her eyes, and then, without meaning to, he spoke. "I tried to stop her from leaving tonight," he said quietly. "I did, but she wouldn't listen." Miss Marple felt the room change. The fire steadied, the air thickened. The truth, long buried beneath fear and secrecy, began to rise gently to the surface. The truth began to slip. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the far end of the lane, where Mrs. Hemsley kept a tidy little house tucked beside the hedgerow. The snow fell more lightly now, drifting in delicate patterns across the path like pale lace. It was a softer cold this afternoon, the kind that settled gently rather than biting sharply. Miss Marple's shawl rustled faintly as she moved, each step careful, calm, and full of the patience that long winters and long mysteries taught her well. She had spoken with Gideon Rowe. She had listened to his trembling silence. Now she needed to speak with the woman who knew Ivy's day-to-day life better than most, her landlady. Mrs. Hemsley opened the door even before Miss Marple knocked, as though she had been watching the lane for her arrival. "Come in, Miss Marple," she said in a brisk yet kindly tone. "You must be chilled through. Let me put the kettle on." Inside, the small kitchen was warm, with a neatly tended fire glowing behind its iron grate. A kettle already simmered at the edge, humming a soft, comforting note that filled the room with promise. Mrs. Hemsley poured tea with practiced ease and set a cup before Miss Marple, who wrapped her hands around it gratefully. The warmth eased into her fingers, the way truth eased into silence when given enough time. "I feared you'd come," Mrs. Hemsley said at last, taking the seat opposite. "Everyone has been talking. Poor Ivy. Such a quiet woman. Too quiet sometimes." Miss Marple nodded gently. "I hoped you might know if anything was troubling her these past weeks." Mrs. Hemsley hesitated, smoothing her apron, thoughtfully. "There was one thing. Hard to explain. She came to me last week asking if I had seen a receipt she'd misplaced. A receipt for money she'd withdrawn. She said she needed it. Needed to prove something. But she wouldn't say what." Miss Marple felt the quiet weight of that detail. A missing receipt. A proof desired. A fear behind it. "And the cottage?" Miss Marple asked. "Was anything else unusual?" Mrs. Hemsley nodded slowly. "The back door. I checked it this morning with the constable. It was unlatched. Ivy never left a door unlatched. Not once in all her years here." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her teacup. The fire crackled. Snow pressed gently at the kitchen window. Mrs. Hemsley leaned in, lowering her voice though no one else was present. "She told me something a few months ago. Said someone from her past had written to her. Someone she never wanted to see again. Someone who frightened her more than she wished to admit." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Did she say who it was?" "Not directly," Mrs. Hemsley sighed. "But she hinted at it. She once had a daughter. Long ago. Placed in care. No one in the village knows that part of her life. Ivy kept it tucked away like an old wound under heavy cloth." The fire glowed brighter, pushing warmth into the pause that followed. A daughter. A past resurfacing. A fear returning. Miss Marple felt the threads shift, the pattern widen, the truth expand beyond the boundaries she had drawn only hours ago. Another path, suddenly opened. Snow muffled every sound as the search party moved along the narrow path behind Willow Bridge. Lanterns swayed in gloved hands, sending small circles of gold over the pale, frozen ground. The frozen stream ahead gleamed faintly under the weak afternoon light, thin ice spreading like glass across the surface. Miss Marple walked at the center of the group, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her steps careful and steady. She had insisted on coming. A silence had lodged itself in her heart since morning, and she would not rest until it was eased. The men ahead slowed, called quietly, lifted lanterns higher. A hush fell so deep it seemed. The snow itself listened. Then Miss Marple saw her. Ivy Harrow lay crumpled near the reeds, her coat dusted with snow, her breath shallow but present. Alive. Very much alive. Two villagers knelt immediately, brushing snow from her shoulders, murmuring reassurances in soft tones. Miss Marple approached gently, her steps light, her voice even lighter. "Ivy, dear," she whispered, kneeling beside her. "You're safe now, you're among friends." Ivy's eyes fluttered, opened, closed again. She trembled not from cold alone, but from a fear that still clung to her like frost. Miss Marple touched her hand, guiding warmth into chilled fingers. Ivy winced slightly, and Miss Marple noticed a bruise around her wrist. Dark, fresh, finger-shaped, a mark made not by a fall, but by someone's grip. Her heart tightened. Kindness rose first, always kindness. She brushed Ivy's hair gently from her face, letting the lantern glow warm her skin. The vicar bent close. "Can you speak, Mrs. Harrow?" he asked softly. But Ivy shook her head. Just once. Firm. Fearful. She would not speak. Or could not. Miss Marple saw the weight behind that silence, the kind that came from sorrow deeper than wounds and heavier than cold. A sudden tug of wind sent a ripple through the thicket nearby. Something dark caught Miss Marple's eye, caught, torn, and held fast on a low thorned branch. She rose slowly, lantern in hand, and walked toward it. Snow crunched softly beneath her boots. The fabric fluttered once, then stilled. A strip of coat material. Wool, thick, torn along one edge. She pulled it free with delicate fingers. Dark brown, rough weave, familiar. She had seen that shade before only yesterday, drying near Gideon Row's roaring fire. Miss Marple held the cloth carefully, letting the lantern's light fill the fibers with quiet truth. A truth she had suspected. A truth she now understood with painful clarity. Behind her, Ivy stirred. A faint sound slipped from her lips, barely audible. Miss Marple turned immediately, kneeling at her side again. Ivy's hand reached out, trembling, grasping nothing but air. Her lips moved. A whisper. Thin. Fragile. But Ivy whispered only one word. Forgive. Evening crept slowly across street. Merrymead, dimming the cottage windows one by one, until only thin lines of lamplight glowed beneath curtains. Miss Marple sat in her small sitting room, the fire burning low but steady, casting warm orange shapes across the familiar furniture. She wrapped her shawl more closely around her shoulders, letting its softness settle her thoughts. A cup of tea rested on the side table, steam rising in a gentle curl. She had waited until the village quieted, until the stir of the search party faded, and Ivy Harrow was safely indoors, before allowing herself to sit and think clearly. Now, in the stillness, every thread of the mystery lay before her. She began with Ivy's locket. Hidden. Cherished. A photograph of a young girl she had never spoken of. Ivy had insisted she had no family, yet the picture revealed otherwise, a daughter placed in care long ago. Miss Marple felt a tender ache at the thought. A mother's silence often came from pain, not indifference. Ivy had carried that pain alone for years. Then the envelopes. Expensive, blue-edged, unusual for a frugal woman, and the torn letter beneath the willow tree. Someone had burned it. Someone had feared its contents. Miss Marple now understood why. Ivy had tried to contact her daughter through a solicitor. A letter of reconciliation, a request, a plea, something she wished to return, something she wished to amend before it was too late. And someone had stopped her. The button in the snow, dark brown, heavy wool, torn, from a coat in a moment of struggle. Miss Marple had seen that coat hanging near Gideon Row's fire, had seen the gloves drying beside it, had smelled the pipe tobacco that Ivy disliked. Gideon had been near her cottage, too near, too often. And the footprints leading toward Willowbridge Path, the deeper prints, the heavier man's stride, matched the pattern she would expect from him. Miss Marple lifted her teacup but did not drink. Her mind followed each step Ivy had taken. Ivy had prepared tea for two. She had expected someone, trusted someone. She had poured warmth into a second cup. And before the tea could cool, Gideon Row had intercepted her letter, perhaps seen the return address, perhaps understood the meaning. A daughter returning could change everything. A daughter could inherit. A daughter could take Ivy away from the village. And from him. Fear, Miss Marple thought softly. Fear had driven him, not hatred, not greed alone. The fear of losing companionship. The fear of losing control. The fear of losing the one person who made him feel needed. He had forced entry through the window. A small force. Enough to startle her. Enough to make her flee into the night. She had run toward the stream. He had followed. The torn fabric, the bruised wrist, the scattered footsteps, the burned letter, all of it fit. Miss Marple's gaze softened, full of sorrow for both Ivy and the man who had caused her such terror. She placed her teacup back on the table and folded her hands gently. It was all so clear now. The window had never been the start. It was the signal. The drawing room at Mrs. Hemsley's house felt unusually warm that evening. A small fire crackled in the grate, spreading soft orange light across the carpet, and warming the edges of the room like a comforting hand placed gently on a troubled shoulder. Miss Marple sat closest to the hearth, her shawl wrapped neatly around her, her expression calm and composed. She had asked for everyone to gather Constable Pork, Mrs. Bantry, Mrs. Hemsley, and Gideon Rowe. There was no anger in her voice, no accusation in her gaze, only kindness, only clarity, the sort of clarity that made truth settle quietly into the places where confusion had lived too long. Constable Pork stood stiffly by the mantel, Mrs. Bantry perched at the edge of a chair, hands clasped. Mrs. Hemsley folded and refolded her apron, anxiety creasing her brow. Gideon Rowe stood near the window, arms crossed tightly, as though bracing against a storm he had long feared would reach him. Miss Marple began gently, her tone low and steady. "We must look at what was left behind," she said. "What the snow revealed. What fear tried to hide." She placed a small box on the table. Inside it lay 5 objects, each gathered carefully, each telling its part of the quiet story. She lifted the broken button first. "This," she said softly, "came from a man's coat, torn in haste, found beneath Ivy Harrow's window. A window forced open from the inside, but disturbed snow outside shows someone reached in." Her eyes drifted to Gideon, not accusing, only inviting truth. Next, she held the 2 teacups, their rims faintly stained. Ivy prepared tea for someone she trusted, someone she expected. 2 cups, 2 seats, but 1 cup had gone cold. A soft pause, and one was still warm. Mrs. Bantry breathed shakily. Mrs. Hemsley pressed a hand to her heart. Miss Marple continued. "The burned letter, found near the willow tree. Torn, scorched, blue-edged paper, the same Ivy purchased last week. She intended to write to her daughter, the daughter she placed in care long ago." Her voice softened further. She feared to hope, but she hoped anyway. Then she lifted the locket. Its silver surface glinted softly in the firelight. "Inside this," she whispered, "Ivy kept the child's photograph, and behind it, the word return, a message, a longing, a step toward reconciliation." She closed the locket gently, as if closing a delicate memory. Lastly, she pointed to the map of footprints she had sketched earlier. 2 sets of prints circled the willow, one belonging to Ivy, one heavier, following, pulling, struggling, and they led from her cottage toward the stream. Not away. Gideon's breath faltered. His hands trembled. The warmth of the fire seemed to recede around him. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "You were afraid, Mr. Rowe. Afraid Ivy would leave. Afraid her daughter would reclaim her. Afraid of losing the companionship you relied on. And fear drove you to the window, to the path, to the struggle." Gideon's face crumpled. A silent break, shoulders shaking. He said nothing. He could not. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Her eyes were kind, sad, certain. But the story wasn't finished. The village of Street Mary Mead settled slowly in the days that followed, as though every cottage, every winding lane, every familiar doorstep needed time to breathe again. Snow softened into gentle layers along the hedges, resting lightly on the rooftops like a blessing laid down by winter itself. The stream thawed just enough to whisper again, its faint trickle a sign that the worst moments had passed. Lanterns glowed warmly behind curtains in the evenings. Doors opened. People spoke in softened voices. And Ivy Harrow, wrapped in blankets and comfort, finally came home to her small cottage near the postbox. Miss Marple visited her each afternoon, never intruding, never pressing. She brought simple things, a knitted shawl, a tin of biscuits, a pot of broth, a fresh pot of tea. Ivy's hands still trembled when she held the cup, but the warmth steadied her, little by little, sip by sip. Healing seldom came quickly, Miss Marple knew. It came in small, measured steps, and Ivy took them bravely. One quiet morning, Ivy opened the locket Miss Marple had returned to her. She held it with the tenderness of someone touching a long, closed door. Her fingers brushed the photograph. Her eyes filled. Then she whispered, barely above breath. She wrote back. Miss Marple smiled gently. Ivy's daughter, now grown, now steady, now ready, had agreed to meet her mother in the coming week, at a small tea shop outside the village, away from gossip, away from fear, a place where beginnings could be gentle. Miss Marple sat beside Ivy as she practiced her words. "I don't know what to say," Ivy murmured. "Start with kindness," Miss Marple said softly. "Then let the rest come on its own." The fire crackled beside them, sending soft orange light across the room. Ivy closed the locket, pressed it to her heart, and something in her posture eased something that had been tight, knotted, hidden for years. The kind of easing that came not from forgetting, but from forgiving. When Miss Marple stepped back into the cold air afterward, she paused on the lane. Everything seemed quieter, gentler. The village moved at its ordinary pace, milk bottles set on steps, children dragging sledges, Mrs. Bantry shaking crumbs for the sparrows. Life returning, as it always did, as it always would. But Miss Marple felt a tug of thought as she walked home, a gentle pull at the edge of her mind. She reflected on all she had seen, fear disguised as control, regret dressed in silence, love buried beneath years of separation. These were not unusual things, she knew. They lived everywhere, in cottages, in letters, in the loud hesitations of human hearts. And she understood them with the tender clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime watching people try, fail, mend and hope again. Yet as she reached her gate and brushed snow from her shawl, a small unease fluttered at the edge of her thoughts. Soft, persistent, unfinished. Yet one question still lingered. The steam rises gently tonight, curling like a quiet reminder of how fragile people can be. Missing figures seldom vanish, because they are truly lost. Most slip away because something inside them trembles, and fear pushes them into the cold before hope can pull them back. We forget that sometimes. We forget how heavy a secret can feel, so let your tea settle, let the warmth steady your thoughts. And remember our little truth of the evening. Truth cools slower than tea. Thank you for sharing this quiet night with us, my friend. These stories breathe because you sit beside them, listening softly, letting the clues settle in your hands. Rest well, stay gentle, and keep a light in your window for those who wander home late. Because even now, beneath the calm, beneath the quiet, but mystery never truly sleeps. Thank you for joining me tonight, my friend. From the open window to the locket on the floor, every small truth guided us gently toward the light. Now tell me, where are you listening from this evening? And which clue caught your attention first? I read every word you share. It keeps our little circle warm. Your presence makes these nights feel softer, safer, and wonderfully alive. I'm grateful you're here, cup in hand, curiosity awake. Rest well. Return soon. Tomorrow, another kettle will boil. Lean in for just a moment. The night has one last whisper to offer. One lonely attic. One vanished letter. One truth waiting in the dust. Some stories begin quietly, tucked behind forgotten doors, where memories settle like old paper. And soon, we'll open that door together. Listen for the clues in the stillness, a soft tea swirl, a gentle page turning, distant bells calling us back. Another mystery is already waking.